The day my son handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Dad, don't open this until you're somewhere safe." I thought he was being dramatic. I tucked it into my coat pocket, patted his arm, and told him I'd be fine. 3 hours later, I was sitting on a bench outside a Walgreens at 9 o'clock at night, with a garbage bag between my feet and nowhere to go. That's when I remembered the envelope. But I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before that night, and who I thought my family was. My name is Albert. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county of Allegheny, Pennsylvania. I have designed drainage systems, road expansions, bridge retrofits, the kind of work nobody notices until it stops working. I retired at 62 with a pension, a paid-off house in a quiet neighborhood outside Pittsburgh, and what I thought was a good life waiting for me. My wife, Ruth, passed 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She was gone in 11 months from diagnosis to burial, and I want to tell you that I have never in my life felt more alone than I did driving home from that cemetery. We had one son together. His name is Conrad. He was 34 when his mother died, already married, already living outside of Columbus with his wife Marlene. They came for the funeral. They stayed 4 days. Then they went back to their life, and I went back to mine. For 2 years after Ruth died, I rattled around that house alone. I cooked bad meals for one. I watched too much television. I called Conrad on Sundays and he always picked up. But the calls got shorter over time. 5 minutes, then 3, then sometimes just a text saying he'd call me back and he didn't. I told myself that's how it goes. People have their own lives. I didn't want to be a burden. Then Conrad called me one Sunday in March and said he and Marlene were thinking about buying a house. Something bigger, in a better school district, because they were expecting my first grandchild. I was going to be a grandfather. I cried after I hung up. Happy tears, the first in a long time. The next call came 2 weeks later. Conrad said the house they wanted was just out of reach. The mortgage payment would stretch them thin. He asked carefully whether I'd ever thought about selling my place in Pittsburgh and moving in with them. Help with the baby. Split some costs. He said Marlene had looked into it, and they'd found a house big enough. One with a separate entrance to the lower level, so I'd have my own space. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I felt wanted. That's the truth. After 2 years of feeling invisible, my son was asking me to be part of something again. I said yes before I'd even thought it through. I sold my house in 6 weeks. The market was good that spring, and I walked away with $430,000 after closing costs. I put $300,000 into a joint savings account with Conrad, his idea, so we could buy the Columbus house outright and avoid the mortgage entirely. The remaining $130,000 I kept in my own account for living expenses. Conrad found a buyer for almost everything in my house. I moved into 2 rooms in their basement with a few boxes, and my late wife's rocking chair. Marlene had a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I noticed it the first weekend I moved in and told myself I was imagining things. She was pleasant enough on the surface, asked how I took my coffee, pointed out where things were in the kitchen, gave me a copy of the Wi-Fi password written on a note card in neat handwriting. But there was something transactional about all of it. Like I was a tenant she was orienting, not a father-in-law she was welcoming. The baby came in October, a little girl, and they named her June. I was in the waiting room when she was born, and when Conrad came through those double doors with his face completely undone, red-eyed, shaking, grinning, I stood up and hugged him for the first time in probably 15 years. That part was real. That part was good. For a while things were okay. I helped with June in the mornings. I made dinners twice a week. I stayed out of their way, kept my space clean, never complained. But I started to notice things. Small things at first. Marlene had a way of speaking to me that was technically polite but carried something underneath it. If I used the main kitchen after 7 in the evening, she'd come down the next morning and rearrange everything I'd touched without saying a word. If I mentioned something about how Conrad and I used to do things, she'd go quiet in a way that said very clearly she didn't care. She started making comments about the basement, how she'd originally planned to use it as a home gym, how the layout of the house wasn't working the way she'd imagined. I told Conrad once, quietly, that I felt like I was making Marlene uncomfortable. He looked tired and said she was just stressed from the baby and the new house. "Give her time, Dad. She'll come around." I gave her time. She did not come around. I gave her time. She did not come around. The money conversation started about 14 months after I moved in. Marlene began raising the subject of shared expenses with increasing frequency. The house was in Conrad's name. We had never put my name on the deed, which I now understand was a mistake I walked into with my eyes open. Marlene proposed a formal arrangement where I would contribute $1,500 a month for room and board. Conrad relayed this to me the same way he relayed most things from Marlene, looking at the floor. I didn't argue. I started paying it. Then she wanted more. Not all at once. That's not how Marlene operated. It was gradual. A request here, a suggestion there. The roof needed repair and it was really everyone's home, so maybe I'd want to contribute. The driveway needed sealing. Little June needed a proper nursery renovation. Each time Conrad would bring it to me with that same tired, apologetic posture. And each time I'd write a check because I didn't want trouble and I didn't know how to say no to my own son. In 22 months, I had transferred just over $90,000 from my personal account. I was aware of the number. I watched it happening. But every time I felt the alarm rising in me, I'd look at June toddling across the living room floor and think, this is family. This is what family does. What I didn't know, what I had no idea was happening, was that Marlene had been researching what it would take to have me declared financially dependent and have my assets consolidated into a family trust she would control. I found this out much later. At the time, I only knew that she had started leaving real estate listings on the kitchen table. Listings for senior living communities in the area. Independent living, they were called, though the subtext was clear. One Thursday evening, Conrad asked me to sit down with him and Marlene at the dining room table. Marlene had a folder. Inside, it was a document, something she'd had drafted by a real estate attorney, she said, proposing that I voluntarily transfer my remaining interest in the household funds and the original $300,000 to a family account in exchange for lifetime residency rights in the home. I read it 3 times. Then I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. Conrad, I said, is this what you want? He didn't answer right away. Marlene answered for him. She said this was the most sensible arrangement for everyone's long-term security. She said she'd had a financial planner review it. She said at my age, it was important to have a structure in place. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I told them I needed time to think. Marlene's expression didn't change. Conrad still wasn't looking at me. I went downstairs and sat in Ruth's old rocking chair for a long time. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere in that house changed completely. Marlene stopped being polite. The transactional coldness became something harder. She made remarks about the cost of utilities. She told Conrad, loud enough that I could hear through the floor, that she couldn't live like this anymore, that it wasn't fair to June, that the situation needed to be resolved. Conrad started coming downstairs less. When I saw him in the kitchen, he was distracted, distant. He'd stopped making eye contact. I reached out to a family attorney on my own. I won't say how I found him, just that I asked around quietly. He told me the arrangement Marlene had proposed was not in my interest in any legal sense, and that I had every right to refuse it. He also told me that without my name on the deed, and with significant funds already transferred, my position in that house was more precarious than I'd understood. I sat with that for 3 days. Then Conrad came downstairs one evening and he sat across from me and he talked to me like his father for the first time in over a year. He told me he was sorry. He said Marlene had been pushing this for months and that he hadn't known how to stand up to it, and he was ashamed of himself. He said he didn't want this for me. He said he had been quietly moving money from his own accounts, carefully over months, so Marlene wouldn't notice, into a separate account in my name only. He'd been doing it since the first time she brought up the residency document. He said he wasn't sure it would come to this, but he wanted to be ready. He handed me a sealed envelope. He told me it was account information and a letter he'd written for me. He said, don't open it until you're somewhere safe. I didn't understand then what he meant by safe. 4 days later, Marlene served me a formal notice, printed on letterhead from her attorney, stating that my arrangement in the home was being terminated and that I had 2 weeks to vacate. She had documented the months of room and board payments as proof of a tenant relationship rather than family residency, which her attorney argued gave her the right to terminate with 2 weeks' notice under Ohio law. I later learned that that's not quite how it works legally, but in the moment, alone in that basement, I didn't know enough to fight it. I called Conrad. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I texted. No response. I started to pack. On the last day, I carried my boxes to the front door. Conrad was home. I could hear him upstairs, but he didn't come down. Marlene stood in the kitchen doorway and watched me make trips back and forth without saying a word. When I brought out the last box, she came to the front door and handed me a garbage bag. "You left some things in the laundry room," she said. Her voice was even. Not cruel exactly. Just final. I took the bag without looking at her. I walked to my car, loaded everything in, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment. Then I remembered Conrad had put something in the laundry room basket the week before. I'd seen him doing it and thought nothing of it. A folded piece of clothing on top of some old towels. I looked at the garbage bag on the passenger seat. It wasn't the items from the laundry room. I mean, they were in there. A flannel shirt, a pair of socks. But underneath all of it, wrapped inside one of the old towels, was a small fire safe. The kind you can get at any hardware store? The zipper combination was Ruth's birthday. I knew it before I even tried it. I drove to a Marriott 15 minutes away and checked in. I sat on the edge of the bed with the safe on the nightstand and the envelope Conrad had given me still in my coat pocket. I opened the envelope first. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, in Conrad's handwriting that still looked like the same handwriting he had in middle school. He explained everything. He said Marlene had started showing her true intentions about a year in, once she realized how much I'd brought to the arrangement. He said he'd stayed silent too long because he was scared. Scared of losing his marriage. Scared of what she might do with the custody arrangements if things fell apart. Scared of being wrong about the person he'd married. He said he was done being scared. He had been systematically transferring funds for 8 months. Every week a small amount, staying under thresholds that might trigger account alerts or questions from Marlene. He'd opened an account in my name at a credit union across town and had been building it up. The total, he wrote, was $246,000. It was the portion of our original $300,000 that hadn't already been spent on the house purchase, plus his own contributions. He wrote that he couldn't give me back the $90,000 I'd paid out. He was sorry for that. But this was what he could do. I opened the safe. Inside was a debit card in my name, the account paperwork, and a sticky note in Conrad's handwriting with the credit union's address and a branch manager's name he said he'd already spoken to on my behalf. I sat on that hotel bed and I wept. Not because of the money, though I won't pretend the money didn't matter, because it did. It mattered enormously. I wept because my son had been watching out for me after all. Quietly, carefully, at real risk to himself. In a situation where it would have been much easier to do nothing. He had chosen me. I called him the next morning. He picked up on the second ring. He was already at the credit union parking lot. He'd driven there before work to make sure everything was in order. We talked for 40 minutes, sitting in our separate cars in different parts of Columbus, and it was the best conversation we'd had in 2 years. Over the following weeks, things moved quickly. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in a Keene complex near a park in the Clintonville neighborhood. The kind of place with a decent community room, a walking trail, neighbors who nodded in the hallway. I furnished it simply. I put Ruth's rocking chair by the window. Conrad retained his own attorney. The financial transfers to Marlene's household account were documented thoroughly enough that there was a real case for recovery of what I'd paid in excess of any reasonable arrangement. The original joint savings, properly traced, was mine to reclaim with interest. I won't say it was easy or fast. It wasn't. But I was not left with nothing. Not even close. Marlene's plan had one fundamental flaw, which her attorney eventually acknowledged in settlement negotiations. She had never actually put my name off the original account. The $300,000 had gone into an account structure that Conrad, as co-holder with me, had rights to manage. Marlene was his wife, not a co-holder. Her control was always dependent on Conrad's cooperation, and Conrad had stopped cooperating. I want to say something here, and I want to say it carefully. There are people who will hear this story and say I was foolish, that I should never have sold my house, never moved my money, never made myself dependent on another person's goodwill at my age. And maybe they're right. I've thought about it enough nights to fill a book, But I also think there's a difference between being foolish and being a father who wanted to be close to his son and meet his grandchild and not die alone in a house that was too quiet. I wasn't foolish for wanting those things. I was only wrong to trust the wrong person while wanting them. My son is not that person. He proved that when it cost him something real to do it. I see June every other weekend now. Conrad brings her to my apartment, and she runs straight to the rocking chair like she owns it, which I suppose in some small way she does. She's 3.5, and she has a grandmother's eyes, which is something I notice every single time and never quite get used to. Conrad and I have dinner together on Thursdays when his schedule allows. We talk about things we should have talked about years ago. We are learning, slowly, how to be father and son to each other in a way that doesn't require suffering to remind us what the other one means. Marlene and Conrad are separated. I don't take any satisfaction in that. Whatever was between them was always going to end the way it ended. I only hope June grows up knowing her father is the kind of man who, when it came down to it, chose the harder and more decent road. The envelope is still on my bookshelf. I kept it. I kept a letter inside it too, folded back exactly the way Conrad had it. Some nights I take it out and read the last line again. He wrote, "I know I waited too long, Dad. I'm sorry, but I'm here now." That's the line I keep coming back to. He is here now, and so am I. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling the weight of it, the edges of it. And the thing I keep coming back to is not the money. The money mattered, yes, but the thing that actually changed me was realizing that consequences are patient. They wait. Every choice Marlene made, every quiet manipulation, every document slid across a table, every dollar she tried to redirect, it all accumulated into something she couldn't outrun. Not because the universe was keeping score in some mystical sense, but because the people around her were paying attention. Conrad was paying attention, and eventually, that attention became action. I think about the kind of person Marlene was, and I don't say this with hatred. I say it with something closer to pity. She was intelligent enough to build a strategy. She understood finances. She understood legal language. She understood how to apply pressure slowly, so nobody noticed. But she made the mistake that clever, dishonest people often make. She assumed that everyone around her was either foolish or too afraid to act. She never accounted for the possibility that my son, quiet and conflict avoidant as he'd become, had a line he wasn't willing to cross. She never understood that decency, when it finally decides to show up, tends to be very thorough. Conrad's choices in those 8 months, moving money carefully, staying silent, protecting me without letting me know I was being protected, that took something I don't have a simple word for. It took clear-eyed thinking under pressure. It took the willingness to assess a situation honestly, even when honesty meant admitting he'd been wrong and complicit for too long. Most people, when they've made a mistake that size, either double down or collapse. Conrad did neither. He made a plan and he worked it quietly, and he didn't stop. And then there was the courage of it. Not dramatic courage, not the kind you see in movies, the quiet kind, the kind that costs you something real. He risked his marriage. He risked a custody fight. He risked the entire structure of the life he'd built. And he did it anyway because there are some things you cannot live with having chosen, and abandoning your father to someone else's greed turns out to be one of them. I think about what I would tell someone who is where I was 3 years ago, moving into a situation that felt like belonging but had the early signs of something else. I would tell them, don't confuse kindness with safety. I was kind. I was accommodating. I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as doing right by my family. It wasn't. There's a version of humility that is actually just fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of being seen as difficult. Fear of admitting you made a mistake by moving in the first place. I lived in that version for too long. But I also know this. I am 67 years old, and I have a Thursday dinner with my son and a granddaughter who runs to that old rocking chair like it's the best thing in any room. I didn't get here by accident. I got here because Conrad chose decency when it was expensive, and because I eventually stopped waiting for things to get better on their own and started protecting myself. That combination, someone doing right by you, and you finally doing right by yourself, turns out to be enough.